I'm an attendant at a bar near the supermarket where it all happened. My name is Kelly, and I don't normally share anything on the internet, but this case marked me out. At that moment, I thought I'd go straight home. That thought crossed my mind more than once as I wandered through the fluorescent-lit aisles of the supermarket, my muscles aching from a double shift behind the bar. But I was out of milk, and there was no way I could face tomorrow without coffee. The store felt deserted, the usual late-night vibe. Tired employees, dim aisles, silence broken only by the hum of refrigerators. I moved quickly, hoping to grab what I needed and leave without drawing attention. The exhaustion weighed heavy on me, dulling my instincts as I went through the motions. Bread, eggs, milk. My thoughts wandered, stuck in a haze from the relentless pace of work. I avoided eye contact with the lone security guard, Edgar, who was more interested in his phone than the store. It wasn't until I approached the exit that everything changed. I spotted him just as I reached the sliding doors, a man in uniform. He stepped in front of me, blocking my way. At first, I thought he was some kind of store security, but then I noticed the badge pinned to his chest. "Excuse me, miss," he said, calm and polite. "I need to see some ID. You match the description of someone involved in suspicious activity." I blinked, confused. I'd never had an encounter with the police in my life, let alone in a supermarket. I felt a jolt of unease, but I tried to stay calm. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice cautious. "I just need to confirm a few things," he said. "It won't take long." There was no one else around except Edgar, slouched behind his post near the entrance, scrolling through his phone, oblivious. I considered calling out to him, but the man in uniform shifted slightly, moving closer. "If you try to run," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "this will get worse. Just come with me quietly." A chill ran through me. Something wasn't right. This wasn't how police encounters were supposed to go. I hesitated, glancing toward Edgar, but he didn't even look up. The man's expression hardened, and he gestured toward a dim corridor leading to the back of the store. "We'll clear this up out of the way," he said, his voice low but firm. Every instinct screamed at me not to go with him, but my exhaustion muddled my thoughts. Was this guy really a cop? What if I was making a mistake? Before I could fully process what was happening, I found myself following him down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. The further we went, the dimmer the lighting became, and the noise from the main part of the store faded into the background. When we reached the back exit, he stopped and leaned in close, the heat of his breath brushing my ear. "No need to make this difficult," he whispered. Something inside me snapped, some small, clear voice cutting through the fog of exhaustion and fear. This wasn't right. I wasn't going to be another story on the news. With shaky hands, I pulled out my phone and hit the emergency SOS alarm. The piercing sound shattered the silence, echoing down the corridor like a siren. The man's eyes widened, and for a second, he froze. Then he lunged, trying to grab my phone, but I was faster. I twisted away, my adrenaline kicking in, and sprinted back down the corridor toward the front of the store. "Help!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Help me!" Edgar, the lazy security guard, finally looked up, startled by the commotion. I burst into the main aisle, the screech of the SOS alarm still blaring from my phone. Behind me, the man hesitated for a moment, realizing that his plan had unraveled. He gave me one last glance, then turned and vanished through the back exit, disappearing into the night. I skidded to a stop near Edgar, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "That guy, he's not a cop," I managed to say between gulps of air. Edgar blinked, still half dazed from his phone-induced trance. "What the hell just happened?" "The real police showed up not long after. I told them everything. The uniform, the badge, the way he had tried to get me to follow him to the back of the store. They took me seriously, though I could tell they were frustrated by how little information I had. We reviewed the store's security footage together. Watching the grainy video felt surreal, like seeing a nightmare play out from a distance. There he was, the man in the uniform, calmly blocking my path, speaking to me with that polite, unsettling tone. "He's not one of ours," the officer said grimly. Another camera caught a glimpse of his car in the parking lot, parked far from the entrance, shrouded in shadows. There were no plates, just an empty frame where they should have been. By the time the officers arrived on the scene, both the car and the man were gone. I sat in the back of a police cruiser, numb from the adrenaline crash, answering questions as best I could. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why had he chosen me? How long had he been watching? And then it hit me, the dating app. I'd been using it for weeks, chatting with strangers, some conversations going nowhere, others lingering longer than they should have. Had he found me through it? Had he seen me post something, checked my location? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. I could still see his face, that too perfect uniform, the empty smile. When I finally got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, staring at the dating app icon. My thumb hovered over it for a moment before I pressed down and deleted it. I knew it wouldn't bring me peace, not entirely, but it was a start. I tried to tell myself that I was lucky, that things could have gone much worse. The truth gnawed at me. Someone out there had been waiting for me to slip up. As I lay in bed, the events of the night replayed in my mind, and I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. Maybe not for a while, but at least I was still here, and that was enough. The idea for the trip had been Emma's, and she wasn't taking no for an answer. She loved hiking, and every chance to get into the wilderness gave her a kind of thrill I didn't fully understand. I agreed to tag along mostly to keep her happy. Jamie, always up for anything, jumped at the opportunity without hesitation. The weather forecast warned of thunderstorms, but Emma brushed it off. "We'll make it to the campsite before it even starts," she had said confidently. So there we were, loaded with backpacks, winding our way down a muddy trail as the forest swallowed us whole. The trees grew thicker the deeper we went, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. Emma led the way with her usual enthusiasm, while Jamie trailed behind, blasting music from his phone and munching on snacks. I followed quietly, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. But as the sky darkened earlier than expected, a knot formed in my gut. I glanced at Emma, who was still charging ahead like nothing could go wrong. I didn't say anything, but deep down, I wished we'd stayed home. The first clap of thunder hit us hard, echoing through the forest like a warning. The rain followed seconds later, coming down in sheets and drenching us in moments. The dirt trail beneath our boots turned to slick mud, and every step felt heavier than the last. Emma's pace faltered, but she kept moving forward, determined to make it to the campsite. Jamie was still in good spirits, but I could feel my patience thinning. This trip was starting to feel more like a bad idea with every passing second. Just when I thought we couldn't get more lost, Emma spotted it, a small, old cabin tucked away among the trees. Its wooden frame looked ancient, sagging under the weight of time and rot. It wasn't the cozy spot I'd imagined for a shelter, but it was better than staying out in the storm. We hurried inside, grateful for the break from the rain, but the smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, mildew, and something else, something rotten. I glanced around the dim interior, feeling a strange sense of unease I couldn't shake. We tried to settle in, but the storm outside was relentless. Thunder cracked overhead, and the rain drummed against the roof like fingers tapping insistently. Emma was restless, pacing back and forth near the door. I could tell she was frustrated by the delay, and before I could say anything, she announced she needed some air. "Just stay close," I told her. She gave me a quick nod and slipped outside, the door creaking shut behind her. I stared after her, hoping she wouldn't be gone long. Minutes passed, then 10. I exchanged a glance with Jamie, who finally put down his bag of chips. "I'll check on her," he muttered, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the door. I stayed behind, telling myself Emma was fine. She just needed space. She always did. But Jamie returned moments later, his expression grim. "She's not there," he said quietly. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest as I followed him outside. We searched the area around the cabin, calling her name into the storm, but all we got in return was the sound of rain and thunder. I couldn't sit still. I grabbed a flashlight and told Jamie I was going to search deeper into the forest. He looked worried, but didn't try to stop me. The forest was a nightmare in the storm. Trees swayed violently, and the mud tried to swallow my boots whole. I shouted Emma's name again and again, but my voice was lost in the roar of the wind and rain. Panic clawed at my throat as I pushed forward, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. Then I saw it. Her jacket, tangled in the branches of a tree. My heart lurched. I reached for it, pulling the soaked fabric free from the limbs, but there was no other sign of her. No footprints, no trail, nothing. It was as if she had just vanished. I stood there, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The storm raged on around me, and the forest felt like it was closing in. I knew I had to get back to the cabin before I got lost too, but leaving without Emma felt like giving up. When I returned to the cabin, Jamie was waiting for me at the door, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I heard footsteps," he whispered, "and I think I heard Emma's voice." His words sent a chill down my spine. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear something, anything, but the storm outside drowned everything. Jamie grabbed my arm. "It didn't sound right," he added, his voice barely audible. Like it wasn't her." We bolted the door and huddled inside, the fear settling over us like a second skin. Then, through the howling wind and rain, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They were slow and methodical, moving around the building in a steady loop. Every muscle in my body tensed. I called out Emma's name, but the footsteps stopped instantly, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be found. The hours dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. The storm outside was relentless, but the footsteps never stopped for long. Every time I tried to peek through the cracked window, all I saw was darkness, illuminated briefly by flashes of lightning. Jamie clutched the flashlight like it was a lifeline, his knuckles white with fear. Neither of us dared to move. It felt like we were being watched, like the cabin itself had become a trap waiting to snap shut. At some point, the footsteps stopped entirely, leaving us in silence. But that silence was worse than the storm. It pressed down on us, suffocating, and all I could do was pray for morning to come. When daylight finally arrived, the forest was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavy, as if the woods were holding their breath. We opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find someone or something waiting for us. But the clearing was empty. The cabin, which had seemed so oppressive during the night, now felt strange in the light. It looked smaller somehow, less real, like it didn't belong in this world. We didn't waste any time. We packed our things and stumbled through the forest until we found a ranger station. The ranger listened carefully as I explained what had happened. He didn't say much, just nodded and promised to send out a search party. His calm demeanor did nothing to ease my fear. It took hours, but they eventually found Emma. She was curled up inside a small cave, soaked to the bone and shivering beside a cold, unlit fireplace. When they asked her what had happened, she shook her head slowly, looking as confused as we felt. "I don't remember," she whispered. "I blacked out after I left the cabin and woke up here." The ride home was quiet. None of us knew what to say, and Emma didn't offer any more answers. The police didn't find any suspects, and the mystery of what happened that night remained unsolved. The gravel crunched under the tires of my truck as I pulled up to the Airbnb. It was set back from the road, half hidden beneath the shadow of pines. The place seemed perfect, quiet, remote, and miles from the nearest town, exactly what I had hoped for. I was desperate to clear my mind, to get away from the noise inside my head that had followed me home from my time overseas. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of wood polish and old leather filled the air. Military memorabilia lined the walls, old medals, a couple of helmets, photographs of soldiers, and a pair of boots, scuffed and neatly positioned by the fireplace. I felt a strange tension coil within me. It wasn't discomfort, not exactly, but familiarity. The kind you don't ask for but can't escape. It clung to me like the remnants of a dream, not fully formed, but hard to shake. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned any of this, only that it was a rustic retreat. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the owner's hobby. After all, a lot of people were drawn to military history. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, that the isolation would do me good. I put my bags down and wandered through the house. The rooms were clean, but old, the kind that never let you forget other people had lived there before you. The lack of cell service annoyed me at first, but part of me welcomed it. No texts, no emails, no reminders that the world was still out there. Just me, the forest, and the memories I came here to outrun. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked a bit in the woods, trying to keep my mind from wandering into places I didn't want it to go. There were no creaks from settling wood, no hum from appliances, just the faint rustle of leaves outside. It was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the house itself was holding its breath. I spent the evening exploring the house more thoroughly. There were dozens of small objects, pins, patches, maps folded into neat triangles. A wall displayed black and white photographs of men in uniform, their faces blurred by time. I studied them closely, as if looking for something familiar. For a moment, I thought I recognized a face among them, but the thought slipped away before I could pin it down. The sense of familiarity unsettled me. It was as if the house knew me in ways it shouldn't. I kept telling myself it was coincidence, just remnants of some veteran's past collecting dust in a forgotten cabin. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, but the night pressed down like a weight, heavy and constant. It happened just after midnight. I was sitting on the couch, staring into the dark, when the old radio in the corner clicked on. A burst of static filled the room, sharp and sudden, making my pulse jump. Then, just as abruptly, the static cut out, replaced by a mechanical voice reading numbers. 34.5290, 82.6490. The coordinates. I knew them instantly. They were for this exact location. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice was calm, precise, almost robotic, as if it had been pre-recorded. And the numbers. Why those numbers? Why here? The military encoding was unmistakable. My mind raced, running through scenarios. Someone was trying to send a message. But to whom? And why use a frequency from this radio, in this house? I stood and switched off the radio, but the unease lingered. Something was wrong. I knew it the way you know a storm is coming, the way the air changes just before everything breaks loose. The morning light brought no comfort. When I walked into the living room, a pair of boots sat by the door. Different boots than the ones I had seen the day before. I hadn't touched the original pair, and there was no reason for another set to be there. My eyes darted to the duffel bag on the floor, another thing I hadn't seen before. The logo on the side was military, faded but unmistakable. The sense of being watched settled over me like a second skin. Someone had been inside the house. There was no other explanation. My mind snapped into focus, years of training kicking in without hesitation. I checked the doors, the windows, every inch of the perimeter. Nothing. But the feeling persisted, and it wasn't just paranoia. I knew, with the same certainty I knew my own heartbeat, that I was not alone in that house. It was deep into the final night when I heard the faintest shuffle of movement, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were listening for it. I was already wide awake, seated in the corner of the living room with my back to the wall, my eyes scanning every shadow. Years of military discipline had burned that vigilance into me. It wasn't something you unlearn, and now it had kicked in full force. A figure emerged from the hallway. At first, I could barely make out the shape, but then moonlight slanted through the window, casting just enough light to reveal the man's outline. He was dressed in full tactical gear, moving like someone trained for stealth. I didn't move. Neither did he. We stared at each other, both of us processing the other's presence. His body was rigid, tense, but not hostile, at least not yet. I could feel the air between us shifting, heavy with the potential for violence. It was strange, almost surreal, to see another soldier standing in front of me. I hadn't expected to feel calm, but I did. My mind was clear, sharp, and ready. In that moment, I knew that whoever this was, he hadn't expected me to be here, and that single fact gave me a sliver of control. The soldier stood his ground, hands loose by his sides, but ready to move at a moment's notice. I didn't speak, there was no need to. My expression must have said enough. Eventually, he shifted, lowering his guard just slightly. "This house," he said finally, his voice low, measured, "is a safe house. The kind used for covert operations, the kind that didn't show up in any official records. A place where agents could disappear, regroup, or prepare for something nobody else knew about." He explained cautiously that the house wasn't supposed to be rented out. The operative assigned to this location was due to arrive tonight. He had mistaken me for that operative, or so he claimed. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. If he was telling the truth, I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple vacation gone wrong. I wasn't supposed to be here, and now I was standing in the middle of someone else's operation, a piece that didn't fit. I stayed silent, weighing my options. If the operative was expected tonight, then whoever was on the other end of this plan would soon realize I wasn't him, and I had no intention of waiting around to see what happened next. I didn't waste time. As soon as the soldier backed off, I grabbed my things and packed with military precision, fast, deliberate, and quiet. My hands worked automatically, muscle memory from years of deployments. The night outside was darker than before, the forest looming on all sides. As I loaded my truck, the thought struck me that I might still be under surveillance. The soldier had let me go, but that didn't mean I was free. For all I knew, someone was still watching, waiting to see what I would do next. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled out, the house disappearing behind me in the rearview mirror. The trees thinned as I drove, but the tension clung to me, an unwelcome passenger. The winding road eventually gave way to the highway, and the house slipped further into memory. But as I drove, I realized something had changed in me. It wasn't just the encounter or the unease of the situation. It was the way my mind had snapped into focus, the way my instincts had taken over without hesitation. I hadn't felt that way since my discharge. And as strange as it felt, I welcomed it, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I knew exactly who I was. The butcher shop sat on the edge of town, tucked between a gas station and an old laundromat. It wasn't the kind of place that drew much attention, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking for anything long-term, just a paycheck and a reason to stay in one place for a while. When I first walked through the door, the smell hit me hard. It wasn't just the metallic tang of raw meat, but something older, like the ghost of every cut that had passed through the shop. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering intermittently, casting the whole place in a sickly yellow glow. Leo, the head butcher, barely looked up as I introduced myself. "You'll be cleaning the back room," he grunted, handing me gloves and a mop. "Start there, and we'll see how you do." The back room was colder than the front, with long steel tables and hooks hanging from the ceiling. A drain sat dead center, the kind used to wash away blood and whatever else accumulated over the course of a day. I tried not to think about it too much. Cleaning the back room wasn't hard, but it didn't take long for the weirdness to start. As I mopped, I noticed deep grooves in the concrete floor, parallel lines scratched into the surface, like something heavy had been dragged across it over and over. They led toward the drain, converging there in messy trails. I told myself it was just equipment, but the thought sat heavy in the back of my mind. Then I found the hatch. It was set flush into the floor, bolted shut with a rusted metal lock. The bolts looked old, but the lock itself had been bent, almost as if someone, or something, had tried to force it open from the inside. I knelt beside it, running my fingers over the metal, my curiosity flaring. I almost opened it. Almost. But something about the way the air seemed to still around me made my hand freeze. I stood up quickly, brushing it off. It was just a hatch. Just a weird little corner of a butcher shop. Nothing to lose sleep over. At least, that's what I told myself. The rest of the day passed slowly, the minutes dragging under the weight of silence. Leo was a man of few words, and I wasn't about to pry. But just before closing, something shifted. A delivery truck pulled up, its headlights cutting through the twilight, and Leo motioned for me to follow. 2 large crates were unloaded, massive wooden boxes, each one padlocked and chained several times over. Together we dragged them into the back room, their weight testing every muscle in my body. The chains clinked ominously as we set them down near the wall, and I could feel my heart racing, though I wasn't sure why. "Keep this quiet," Leo muttered, brushing past me with a look that dared me to ask questions. I nodded, even though curiosity gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Leo locked the front door, and the hum of the refrigerator units was the only sound left in the shop. The moment Leo left, I found myself staring at the crates. I knew better than to mess with them, but something about them wouldn't leave me alone. It was the weight, the chains, the fact that Leo hadn't offered any explanation. My hands moved before my brain caught up, grabbing a crowbar from the corner. The lock gave with a sharp crack, and I pried the lid open. Inside was a mess of personal belongings: shoes, neatly folded clothes, and a weathered duffel bag filled with odds and ends. There was no body, but the implication hit me all the same. Whoever these things had belonged to wasn't coming back for them. I stood there for a long time, staring at the contents of the crate. The air in the room felt heavier now, and the hum of the refrigerator unit seemed louder. I was still standing over the open crate when Leo walked in. I expected him to yell, to throw me out, or worse, but he didn't. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "You've seen it now," he said quietly. His tone was calm, almost casual, as if we were talking about the weather. "So here's the deal. You can stay and learn to live with it, or you can leave and pretend this never happened." There was no malice in his voice, no threat, just a simple statement of fact. I stared at him, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to get out. But there was something in the way he looked at me, like he already knew what I was going to choose. "I'll leave," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Leo nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected all along. I left the butcher shop that night, but the memory followed me. The image of the crate, the clothes, and the duffel bag haunted me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. I told myself it was just a job, just a strange little shop in a town I wouldn't stay in long. But the thought kept gnawing at me. What was really going on behind those doors? For days, I debated going to the police. I even rehearsed what I'd say. But every time I thought about it, the weight of Leo's words pressed down on me. Learn to live with it, or leave. I had chosen to leave, but somehow I didn't feel any safer. The letters started showing up about a week later. They weren't threats exactly, just vague, cryptic messages that made it clear someone knew what I was thinking. "Don't make a mistake you can't take back." The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and there was no return address. Whoever sent them knew what I had seen, and they wanted to make sure I stayed quiet. I packed my bags and left town without telling anyone where I was going. I found a new city, a new job, and tried to bury the memories of the butcher shop as deep as I could. But no matter how far I went, it followed me. Working in the night shift at the gas station was far from glamorous, but it was all I had. The station was isolated, perched along a stretch of deserted highway that saw more tumbleweeds than cars. Nights blurred together, long and uneventful, each one filled with the hum of flickering fluorescent lights and the rhythmic buzzing of the refrigerators. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. It was just another job, one in a series of jobs that I never intended to stay in for long. The loneliness of the place weighed on me, but I told myself it was better this way. No drama, no expectations. Just me, the occasional traveler, and the lingering smell of diesel and stale coffee. My only regular company came in the form of Rob and Kyle, two guys I'd known since high school. They weren't exactly friends, more like a habit I couldn't break. They used me for free snacks, cigarettes, and a place to hang out when they had nothing better to do. I knew what they were doing, and part of me hated them for it. But another part, maybe the bigger part, was afraid of what my nights would be like without them. Even if our conversations were shallow and full of dumb jokes, they filled the silence. I clung to their company the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. I knew they weren't good for me, but they were all I had. The night had been as quiet as usual, just me and the hum of the neon signs, when the door burst open and Rob and Kyle rushed inside. They were out of breath, their eyes wild with fear. Kyle locked the door behind them, glancing nervously out the window. "Danny, man, you gotta help us," Rob whispered, his voice sharp and desperate. "The cops are on our ass." My stomach dropped. This wasn't a prank. The panic on their faces was real. I wanted to tell them to leave, to get out before they dragged me into whatever mess they were in. But I couldn't. Instead, I stood frozen, heart racing, as they begged me for a place to hide. "Please," Kyle hissed. "Just let us use the back room. They won't know we were here." I knew this was a bad idea. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to tell them they were on their own. But fear and loyalty clashed inside me, and before I knew what I was doing, I nodded. "Go," I whispered. unlocking the back room door. "But stay quiet." Rob gave me a quick, grateful nod before slipping through the door with Kyle. As they disappeared into the shadows, I leaned against the counter, trying to calm my racing heart. It didn't take long for the flashing lights to appear, casting eerie blue and red patterns against the station walls. 2 officers stepped inside, their boots heavy on the tile floor. One of them, tall with a face carved by years of night shifts, approached the counter. "We're looking for 2 men," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "They came this way. You see anything suspicious tonight?" My throat went dry, and the words caught in my mouth. The smart thing to do would have been to tell the truth, to point them toward the back room and let them deal with it. But fear twisted my thoughts, and before I knew it, I shook my head. "No," I said, forcing the word out. "Haven't seen anyone all night." The officer studied me for a moment, and it felt like his gaze cut straight through my skin. My pulse hammered in my ears. He glanced around the store, scanning the aisles and the dim corners. Then he gave me a slow nod. "If you see or hear anything, you call us." I managed a weak nod as they turned and walked out, leaving the station in silence once more. The second the police were gone, I stormed into the back room, slamming the door shut behind me. Rob and Kyle sat huddled in the corner, their faces pale and sweaty. "What the hell is going on?" I hissed, keeping my voice low. Rob shot Kyle a nervous glance before unzipping the black duffel bag at their feet. He pulled out a wad of cash and tossed it onto the floor. It was followed by a tangled mess of gold chains, rings, and watches. My stomach churned as I spotted the butt of a gun buried at the bottom of the bag. "We hit a couple places," Rob admitted, his voice tight with fear. "Didn't think the cops would be on us this fast." My hands clenched into fists. This wasn't some stupid prank or a joyride gone wrong. They had committed serious crimes, and now I was in the middle of it. I slumped against the counter, head spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Rob and Kyle were criminals. There was no denying that now, and by helping them, I had put myself in the crosshairs of the law. I glanced toward the back room, where they sat whispering in frantic tones. My mind raced with possibilities. I could keep my mouth shut, let them leave, and pretend I never saw anything. Or I could call the police and turn them in. Neither option felt good. If I stayed loyal, I'd be tied to their crimes, always looking over my shoulder. But if I betrayed them, I'd lose the only friends I had, even if they weren't really friends at all. Before I could make a decision, headlights appeared outside. More police cars. This time they weren't here to ask questions. The officers approached with purpose, their faces grim and determined. I knew what they were here for, and in that moment, I made my choice. "They're in the back room," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. The officers didn't waste any time. They moved in, guns drawn, barking orders as they burst through the door. Rob and Kyle didn't even try to fight. They were cuffed and dragged outside, their shouts of protest swallowed by the hum of the station's neon lights. I stood behind the counter, watching in silence as my so-called friends were stuffed into the back of a patrol car. The betrayal burned deep, but at the same time, I felt something else, a strange, quiet relief. As the officers finished their work, one lingered behind. He approached me slowly, studying my face with a look that was hard to read. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Was it really the right thing? Or just the easiest way out? The officer gave me a small, sympathetic smile before turning to leave. I watched as the patrol cars disappeared into the night, the silence of the highway creeping back in. The gas station felt emptier than ever once the cars were gone. I stood behind the counter, the weight of the night settling over me like a heavy blanket. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. But instead of fear, I felt something else, a strange sense of peace. I knew things would be different from now on. Rob and Kyle were gone, and with them went the toxic friendship that had kept me tied to this place. I didn't know what the future held, but for once, I wasn't afraid of it. I was okay with being alone. I moved into the neighborhood on a cold October afternoon, the wind biting at my skin as I unloaded the last box from the car. It was a relief to finally have my own space, a place to reset after the divorce, far from familiar streets and faces. The house wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. The development was still under construction, a skeleton of a suburb. Rows of unfinished homes stood like silent sentinels, some with only frames and plastic sheeting, others with exposed insulation flapping in the wind. My house was one of the few completed ones, a rare patch of light among the emptiness. The marketing brochures had promised a modern, lively community, but the reality was more unsettling, a strange limbo where everything felt half-formed, incomplete. I had hoped the quiet would be comforting, a blank slate for my new life. But standing there, surrounded by empty lots and looming construction, I felt something else entirely, a sense of vulnerability I couldn't quite explain. The nights were the worst. The streetlights, installed haphazardly along the winding roads, cast uneven pools of yellow light, leaving long stretches of shadow between houses. When the wind picked up, it carried the sound of loose tarps snapping against wooden beams, making it impossible to tell where the noise came from. At first, I thought I'd grow used to it, but instead, the strange acoustics played tricks on me. A clatter from a distant construction site sounded as if it were just outside my window. A gust of wind against an unfinished frame became footsteps in the night. Every noise seemed closer than it should have been, and the emptiness of the neighborhood amplified every sound. To cope, I leaned heavily on the smart home system I'd installed. Security cameras, motion detectors, automated locks. Each device gave me a small sense of control over the unpredictable landscape outside. The system became a second set of eyes, keeping watch over the shadows I couldn't see. But even with that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the camera alert that first caught my attention. The doorbell camera had triggered at exactly 3:47 a.m. Nothing unusual, except the footage showed nothing. No car, no person, not even a stray animal. Just the dim glow of the streetlight and the shadow of my porch swaying gently in the night breeze. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just a glitch. But 3 nights later, it happened again. 3:47 a.m., exactly. No visible cause. I reviewed the footage over and over, my mind spinning through possibilities, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the quiet hum of the night. That's when I decided to dig into the system logs. I wasn't just curious, I was unsettled. And what I found only made things worse. At 3:46 a.m., exactly 1 minute before the doorbell triggered, the garage door registered a slight movement. Not enough to open it, just a small shift, like someone testing the mechanism. It wasn't a glitch, it was deliberate. I knew, without a doubt, that someone was testing my home. The precision of the timing, the same minute every third night, was too methodical to be a coincidence. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were studying my routines, mapping out weaknesses. I didn't panic. That's not how my mind works. Instead, I treated the situation the way I would a corrupted database. Gather data, find the pattern, fix the problem. I reviewed every log, every alert, mapping out the intruder's activity. Each piece of information confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't random. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. As the nights passed, the tension grew. I started sleeping lighter, waking up at the slightest sound. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind felt like a warning. I knew I was being watched, and the worst part was not knowing when the intruder would decide to act. I kept my focus sharp, determined to find out who was behind the intrusion. There were no cameras outside the perimeter of my property, but I began noticing subtle things around the neighborhood. A ladder leaning against a half-built frame that hadn't been there the night before. A toolbox left on the curb, closer to my house than it should have been. I knew the construction workers came and went irregularly, but I started keeping notes on their vehicles. One white van stood out, a familiar presence during the day, always parked just a little too close to my driveway. It didn't belong to any of the official crews listed by the development company. My instincts told me that whoever was driving that van wasn't just here for construction. The real breakthrough came when I dug deeper into the logs and realized that the same devices being manipulated at my house, garage sensors, doorbell triggers, had been installed by the same crew across the entire development. Someone had insider knowledge of the system, and they were using it to probe for weaknesses, starting with my home. That night, I stayed up late, watching the feed from my cameras, trying to stay ahead of whoever was out there. The clock ticked toward 3:46 a.m., and right on time, the garage sensor flickered. A slight shift, as if someone was pressing against the door. My pulse quickened, but I kept my hand steady on the tablet, logging everything in real time. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the garage, followed by a soft metallic click. Whoever was out there wasn't just testing anymore. They were about to make their move. I dialed the police, keeping my voice low. As I waited for them to arrive, I stayed perfectly still, my eyes glued to the camera feed. The minutes dragged by, each second heavier than the last. At 3:47 a.m., the doorbell camera triggered, and I saw him, a man in dark clothing, crouched near the garage, tools in hand. The sight sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't some opportunistic thief. He had come prepared. Just as he reached for the garage handle, blue and red lights cut through the night. The police car skidded to a halt in front of my house, and the man bolted, sprinting toward the white van parked down the street. He didn't get far. The officers tackled him before he reached the van, pinning him to the ground as he struggled. I watched from the window, my breath fogging up the glass. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with something else. A lingering fear of how close I had come to being his first victim. The man turned out to be a former construction worker who had helped install the smart home systems across the development. He had been laid off a few weeks earlier, but not before learning enough about the home's security to exploit their vulnerabilities. When the police searched his van, they found burglary tools and detailed plans of multiple houses in the area. My house had been his first target, a dry run to see how much resistance he would encounter. If I hadn't caught the pattern in time, he would have been inside that night, and I might not have known until it was too late. I no longer saw the isolation as a threat. It was something I could navigate, something I could prepare for. In a way, the experience gave me what I didn't know I needed. My technical mindset had saved me, and knowing that I had stopped something terrible before it could happen gave me a strange sense of control over the uncertainty of my new life. It wasn't the peaceful new beginning I had hoped for, but it was enough. I could live with that, and I would stay vigilant because now I understood the truth. Safety is not a given. It's something you have to create for yourself, over and over, every single day. I pulled into the campground just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The drive had been long, but the scenery was worth it. Miles of forest in every direction, leaves just starting to turn gold and red. Perfect. As I started unloading my gear, I noticed another car pull up a few sites down. A woman got out, looking a bit overwhelmed as she surveyed her surroundings. Clearly a newbie. I was just finishing up when the campground host rolled up in a golf cart. "Evening, folks," he called out. "Name's Tom. Just wanted to welcome you and go over a few ground rules." Tom was your typical outdoorsy type, weathered face, flannel shirt, the works. He gave us the usual spiel about fire safety, bear precautions, and where to find him if we needed anything. "Looks like it's just you two for now," Tom said. "Quiet weekend. Oh, and there's a bit of weather coming in tomorrow night, so make sure you secure your tents." I nodded, already planning to double-check my guy lines. The woman, Sarah, I learned, looked a bit nervous at this news. As Tom drove off, I caught Sarah's eye. "First time camping?" I asked. She nodded, a bit sheepishly. "That obvious, huh?" I shrugged. "We all start somewhere. I'm Mike, by the way. Let me know if you need any help setting up." Sarah smiled gratefully, and I felt a twinge of something. It had been a while since I'd felt that. Shaking it off, I turned back to my campsite. I was here to clear my head, not to meet someone new. The storm hit harder than any of us expected. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of wind howling through the trees and rain pelting my tent. For a moment, I was worried the whole thing might blow away. As the storm raged on, I heard a shout from Sarah's direction. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped my tent and peered out. Sarah was struggling with her tent, which was on the verge of collapse. Without thinking, I ran over to help. Together, we managed to secure her tent, both of us getting soaked in the process. As we finished, a loud crack echoed through the campground, followed by a deep rumbling sound. "What was that?" Sarah yelled over the wind. "No idea," I shouted back. We made our way to Tom's RV, but found it dark and empty. Odd, I thought. Where would he go in this weather? As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. Sarah and I, along with the few other campers, gathered near the entrance to assess the damage. That's when we saw it. A massive mudslide had completely blocked the road out. "We're trapped," someone muttered. "Where's Tom?" another camper asked. "He'll know what to do." But as we looked around, it became clear that Tom was nowhere to be found. His RV was still there, but there was no sign of the man himself. A feeling of unease settled over the group. We were cut off from the outside world, and the one person who knew this place best had vanished without a trace. The next few days were a blur of failed attempts to contact the outside world and dwindling supplies. Cell phones were useless, no signal this far out. The campground's emergency radio was in Tom's RV, but none of us could figure out how to operate it properly. Tensions ran high among the campers. Some wanted to try hiking out, but I knew how dangerous that could be without proper knowledge of the area. Sarah surprised me by backing me up, pointing out the risks of getting lost or injured. As the days wore on, Sarah and I found ourselves working together more and more. She was smart and resourceful, quick to learn the survival skills I showed her. We rationed food, collected rainwater, and kept the group's spirits up as best we could. But Tom's disappearance weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Had he abandoned us? Was he hurt somewhere, needing our help? The uncertainty was almost worse than our predicament. By the 5th day, we knew we had to do something. Our supplies were running critically low, and there was still no sign of rescue. Sarah suggested we organize a thorough search for Tom. Maybe he'd left some clue about another way out. We split into teams, combing every inch of the campground and the surrounding area. Sarah and I took the area near the mudslide. As we carefully picked our way through the debris, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Mike, look at this," she said, pointing to a bit of fabric snagged on a broken branch. It looked like a piece of flannel, the same kind Tom always wore. Following this clue, we pushed further into the tangle of mud and fallen trees. That's when we heard it, a faint call for help. "Tom?" I shouted. "Tom, is that you?" A weak voice responded, barely audible. We'd found him. It took hours of careful digging, but we finally freed Tom from where he'd been pinned by the mudslide. He was dehydrated and a bit banged up, but alive. Turns out he'd been trying to secure some loose equipment when the mudslide hit. As we helped Tom back to the campground, he mentioned something that made us all perk up. "There's an old trail," he said weakly. "Not on any maps. Locals use it sometimes. Might be clear." With renewed energy, we followed Tom's directions. Sure enough, hidden behind a thick growth of bushes was a narrow trail. It was rough going, but after a few hours of hard hiking, we emerged on a rural road, miles from the campground. As we waited for the rescue vehicles to arrive, I found myself sitting next to Sarah. We were exhausted, dirty, and probably smelled terrible, but I couldn't help smiling at her. "So," I said, "still glad you decided to try camping?" She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made me feel warm despite the chill in the air. "You know what, I think I am." As we were checked over by paramedics and gave our statements to local authorities, I realized something. For the first time since my divorce, I wasn't dwelling on the past. Somehow, in the midst of this disaster, I'd found something to look forward to. It was just another quiet evening. I'd been home alone for the weekend, enjoying the peace and catching up on some TV. I'm called Greg, and at the time of this event, I was around 37. My girlfriend Anna was away for work, and Max, our old dog, was curled up next to me, snoring softly. The house felt unusually still that night, almost too still. It's the kind of thing you don't really notice until the silence creeps up on you. The sound of the TV was the only thing breaking the quiet, but even then, it seemed distant. Outside, it was pitch black, not a single car passing by. I remember glancing at the clock. It was already past 11. The day had been uneventful, so I figured I'd just finish my show and call it a night. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from the back door. It wasn't much, just a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the door. I glanced over at Max, expecting him to react, but he didn't even stir. I figured it was probably just the wind. Living in the suburbs, you get used to little noises now and then. Houses settle, branches scrape against windows, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, something about that sound stuck with me. I muted the TV for a second, just to listen. Silence. I shook it off and turned the volume back up, trying to push the feeling away. But the noise came again, this time louder. It wasn't just a one-off thing. It kept going, like something or someone was outside. Max finally perked up, his ears twitching. I felt a little jolt of unease. Normally, I wouldn't think twice, but with Anna gone and the house so still, it was hard to ignore. I got up, not wanting to overreact, but also needing to check. I headed toward the back door, flipping on the light as I went. The kitchen was dark, except for the soft glow from the hallway. As I reached the door, my hand hesitated on the lock. I'd locked it earlier. I was sure of it. But now, the door was cracked open just a bit. That felt really weird. I hadn't opened that door all night. Max was now at my side, his tail stiff, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I felt my pulse quicken as I reached out and slowly pulled the door open, stepping outside to take a look. The backyard was dark, the only light coming from the porch lamp behind me. I could see the grass was damp from earlier rain, but there, leading away from the door, were muddy footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone had been here. I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around it. I glanced around the yard, scanning the fence line, the corners, anywhere someone could be hiding. Nothing. But the footprints were fresh. Just as I was about to step back inside, everything went black. The power cut out, plunging the house and the yard into complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled my way back into the kitchen. Max was growling louder now, his hackles raised. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but the small beam only lit up a tiny circle in front of me. I could still hear it, the sound of footsteps inside the house. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Max and hurried to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher everything, the noises, the footprints, the power outage. She assured me that officers were on their way, but it felt like they couldn't get here fast enough. The house was eerily quiet again, except for the occasional creak or shuffle from somewhere deeper inside. I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, but I knew better. Someone had been inside. Maybe they still were. Max stayed close, still growling, but his eyes were locked on the door as if he expected something to come through at any moment. I sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting, but all I could do was sit tight and hope the police would arrive before anything worse happened. When the knock on the door finally came, I almost didn't believe it. I opened it to find 2 officers standing there, their flashlights shining through the darkness. They checked the house from top to bottom, but by the time they were done, there was nothing to find. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the house. The muddy footprints I'd seen, gone. Just smudges in the grass like they'd never been there in the first place. They assured me everything looked fine, but I could tell they didn't quite believe my story. I was safe. Max was safe. But as I stood there watching the officers drive away, and I know they did what they could, but in the end something still remains inside me. I locked every door and window twice that night, and I hardly slept that night after all the events. Whoever it was, they'd been in my house. I felt a sense of unease, but at least I had Max with me to warn me and even help if necessary. It was a dumb idea, but I guess all of Max's ideas were like that. We were 2 bored teenagers, stuck in a dead-end summer, with nothing but skateboards and bad decisions to keep us occupied. This time, the brilliant plan was checking out the old Motel Sunridge on the outskirts of town. It had shut down years ago after some weird incident, nothing mysterious, just bad plumbing and worse management. But Max swore people said it was haunted. I knew better, but what else were we going to do on a Friday night? The place was hidden behind a crumbling chain-link fence, surrounded by weeds tall enough to slap at your shins. We hopped the fence and crept toward the motel, laughing under our breath like we weren't up to anything. The parking lot was cracked, littered with old beer cans and busted tires, and the building itself, a sad shell, with broken windows and faded signs, long past its prime. "Look at this dump," Max muttered. nudging an old door with the tip of his sneaker. "It's practically a museum." He was right. It looked like someone just hit the off switch one day and walked out. The motel's office still had dusty keys on the rack. Inside, the hallway reeked of mildew and stale air. The wallpaper peeled in ugly strips like the walls were trying to shed their skin. I followed Max to the first floor, where we found the usual mess: trashed rooms, broken beds, busted-up TVs. He was poking through old drawers, swearing he was going to find something cool, while I kept my phone out, taking random pictures for kicks. Then we saw it, room 107. The door was cracked open, but there was something off about it. The air inside felt heavy, like stepping into a room where someone had just been smoking, but it didn't smell like smoke. It was just stale. "Betcha there's something freaky in here," Max whispered, grinning. We pushed the door open all the way and stepped inside. The bed was made, and the TV remote was sitting on the nightstand like someone had checked in just yesterday. Weirdest of all, there were shoes, sneakers, sitting by the door. Max chuckled, but I felt this knot twist in my gut. "Dude, someone's been in here," I said, lowering my voice. "Nah, man, this place has been empty for years." That's when we heard it. A low creak, like someone shifting their weight somewhere nearby. We both froze, eyes darting toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. My skin crawled. Max, being the idiot he always was, gave me this smirk and whispered, "Bet you won't look in there." Before I could tell him where to shove it, he nudged the bathroom door open with his foot. And that's when we saw them. Two guys, crouched on the floor, staring right at us. They looked off. Pale, skinny, wearing dirty clothes like they'd been in the same outfit for days. Their eyes didn't blink. They just watched us, heads tilted slightly, like animals deciding whether or not to pounce. "Oh my gosh." Max barely got the words out before the two guys shot to their feet. We bolted. No time to think, just pure instinct. Max and I scrambled out of the room, our shoes skidding on the dirty tiles as we tore down the hallway. The sound of their footsteps was right behind us, pounding hard, like they had nothing to lose. "Go, go, go!" Max screamed, but I didn't need the encouragement. We hit the stairs, sliding down the steps so fast I almost lost my balance. They were still behind us, close enough that I could hear one of them breathing hard through clenched teeth. My heart was about to explode, but we didn't stop. The hallways blurred as we sprinted toward the back exit, dodging old furniture and shattered glass. It felt like the whole motel was closing in on us, as if we'd never find the way out. Finally, Max spotted the door. He slammed into it with his shoulder, and we burst into the cool night air, lungs burning. But the guys weren't giving up. They followed us outside, their footsteps relentless. We sprinted across the parking lot and toward the overgrown fence. My legs screamed, but fear kept me moving. Max hit the fence first, scrambling up and over it like his life depended on it. I followed right behind, barely making it over before one of the guys lunged toward me, his dirty hand just missing my ankle. We hit the ground running, stumbling through the weeds until we reached the road. Only then did we finally stop, gasping for air, hunched over with our hands on our knees. Max looked over at me, wide-eyed but grinning like a lunatic. "What the hell was that, dude?" he wheezed. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "No clue, but I'm not going back in there." We stood there for a minute, just listening to the night, making sure we weren't being followed. The motel stood quiet in the distance, dark and still, as if nothing had happened. We never told anyone what happened that night. When I first moved into the neighborhood, everything seemed perfect. My new house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by identical, well-kept lawns and peaceful streets. The kind of place where everyone waved hello but didn't pry too much into each other's lives. It felt like the right place to start fresh, to settle into my new job, and enjoy a quieter lifestyle. I didn't expect to become fast friends with my neighbors, but I figured I'd at least feel comfortable. That was until I noticed the guy next door. He lived in the house directly beside mine, though you wouldn't know it by looking. The lawn was unkempt, unlike the rest of the street, and I never saw him talking to anyone. He didn't come out during the day much either. At first, I barely noticed him. Moving kept me busy, and I was more focused on getting settled into my new routine. But after a few weeks, His odd habits started to stick out. I'd see him standing in his front yard at the strangest times, sometimes just staring at nothing, as if he was waiting for something to happen. One time, I came home late from work, and there he was, standing under the streetlight, just watching. No phone, no dog, nothing to explain why he'd be out there at 10 p.m. I brushed it off, telling myself that maybe he just liked the quiet nights. But the more I noticed, the harder it was to ignore. The odd behavior kept happening, and it was starting to get to me. I'd see him late at night through my window, either standing in his yard or pacing back and forth. Sometimes he'd be out there digging. At first, I thought he might be gardening, but he didn't plant anything. He was just digging random holes, covering them back up a few hours later. I couldn't figure out what he was doing. During the day, he was mostly invisible. The lights in his house were always off, and I never saw anyone come or go. It was as if the house itself was just a shell, and he only existed when it got dark. Every time I saw him outside, I'd get that creeping feeling that I was the only one noticing these things, like everyone else on the street had tuned him out. I tried to shrug it off. People have their quirks, right? Maybe he was just one of those eccentric types who liked his own company. But as the days went on, it became harder to dismiss. I started to feel uneasy in my own home. Every time I looked out my window, I half expected to see him standing there again, watching. One night, it was worse than usual. I was getting ready for bed when I saw him again, this time in his backyard. He had a shovel, digging deeper than I'd ever seen before. The moonlight was just bright enough that I could make out a large tarp beside him. I couldn't tell what was under it at first, but as he worked, he started pulling out what looked like clothes. Old, tattered clothes and other personal items. Shoes, a backpack, even some jewelry. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some harmless quirk. Something was very wrong. Who buries things like that in their backyard? And why was he digging it all up now? My mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I could call the police, but what if I was overreacting? What if he was just a hoarder or something? Still, the sight of those clothes and the way he moved like he knew he shouldn't be seen sent a chill through me. The next morning, I was feeling that I needed to do something. I called the police and told them about the neighbor's strange behavior. They didn't seem overly concerned, but they agreed to come by and check it out. When they arrived, I watched from my window as they questioned him in his driveway. He was calm, even friendly, like he hadn't been the guy creeping around at all hours. They searched his backyard, walking over the spots where he had been digging. But by then, it was too late. Everything was covered up again, and they didn't find anything suspicious. They left not long after, and he went right back to his routine. No consequences, no answers. I felt a mix of frustration and fear. I'd expected some kind of resolution, but instead I was left with even more uncertainty. Now I wasn't just uneasy, I was terrified. After the police visit, I knew I couldn't stay. Even though they hadn't found anything, I could feel that something wasn't right. I started looking for a new place, something far from here, where I wouldn't have to worry about what might be lurking next door. Within a few weeks, I packed up and left. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. It looked just as ordinary as ever, the kind of place where nothing bad could possibly happen. But I knew better. Sometimes the worst things don't leave obvious marks.